It was on the fateful evening of April 14, 1865, the day American history changed forever. The night Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. It was at the Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. I still remember how the place buzzed with anticipation and excitement. The air smelled of candle wax, cheap cologne, and sweat. I, a humble theater enthusiast, had secured a seat in the balcony, close enough to see the stage, but far enough to observe the entire scene. The audience chattered, their voices blending into a low hum. The play, Our American Cousin, had already begun, and the laughter from the comedic scenes echoed through the hall. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. The spotlight, both literal and metaphorical, fell upon President Abraham Lincoln. His tall frame, draped in a black coat, sat in the presidential box. His face, etched with the weight of the Civil War, bore lines of both wisdom and sorrow. The audience hushed as he leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the stage. And then, as if scripted by fate, a shadowy figure emerged. John Wilkes Booth, a renowned actor himself, stepped into the box adjacent to Lincoln's. Even from where I sat, I could see his eyes burned with a fanatic fire, a fire fueled by hatred and misplaced loyalty. Booth had been brooding over the Confederacy's defeat, and this night, he had decided to alter history. Booth's hand trembled as he withdrew a small Derringer pistol from his pocket. The metal glinted under the gaslight. He leaned toward Lincoln, his breath hot and venomous. I strained to hear his whispered words. "The South shall rise again, and you, Mr. Lincoln, shall fall." The play continued, but my attention remained fixed on Booth. As the uproarious laughter echoed from the stage, Booth raised the pistol. The room seemed to hold its breath. The shot rang out, a sharp crack that pierced the air. Lincoln slumped forward, blood staining his shirt front. Clearly, Booth's shot had wounded Lincoln. Pandemonium erupted. The audience gasped, some fainting, others screaming. I too wanted to get out of there as fast as I could. No one knew if there were other gunmen in the crowd. At that point, I noticed the shooter, Booth, leap onto the stage, his black cape billowing like a vengeful spirit. He shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis." These words translate to, "Thus, always to tyrants." I came to understand later this phrase is the motto of the state of Virginia, and has been associated with acts of rebellion against tyranny throughout history. Booth believed he was avenging the South and striking a blow against tyranny by assassinating Lincoln, whom he viewed as a tyrant for his policies during the Civil War. The spotlight now shifted to the dying president, his life slipping away. President Abraham Lincoln, once a beacon of hope and resilience, now lay slumped in his chair, his life's light dimming. The bullet from John Wilkes Booth's pistol had found its mark, and the president's breathing became labored, each breath a shallow battle. Mary Todd Lincoln, his wife, clutched at his hand, her eyes wide with terror and disbelief. Her sobs pierced the stunned silence. The president's bodyguard, shocked into action, called for a doctor, his voice a desperate plea that cut through the chaos. It was a truly sad sight. Dr. Charles Leal, a young Army surgeon in attendance, rushed to the president's side. His hands, steady despite the turmoil, searched for the wound, a small, sinister hole behind the president's left ear. The prognosis was grim. The bullet had lodged deep, and the damage was irreparable. I then watched them carry Lincoln across the street to the Peterson house. The president's long limbs hung limp. His iconic stovepipe hat had been left behind on the stage amongst the scattered chairs and personal belongings from fleeing theater-goers. In a small back room of the Peterson boarding house, Lincoln was laid upon a bed too short for his tall frame. His breathing grew fainter, the intervals longer. Around him, his cabinet members, friends, and his inconsolable wife kept a somber vigil, their faces etched with grief and the weight of a nation's sorrow. Through the night, Lincoln held on to life. A crowd remained outside the building praying and hoping, but as dawn approached, his pulse waned and the light of his eyes dimmed. At 7:22 a.m., on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, passed into the ages. His last breath was a quiet surrender, a final release from the burdens he had carried. In those last moments, the world lost not just a leader, but a symbol of unity and freedom. And I, as an imagined witness to this pivotal moment in history, can only recount the profound loss felt by all who believed in Lincoln's vision for America. How could this have happened? What if Lincoln had chosen a different seat? What if Booth's aim had faltered? What if the doctors had arrived sooner? As I write this account, I recall the horror etched on Lincoln's face, the realization that he would not live to see the Union restored. The theater, once a place of laughter, became a chamber of tragedy. And I, an eyewitness, carry this burden of history. A tale of sweat-soaked brows, whispered threats, and a nation forever changed. What drove Booth to commit such an unthinkable act? Some said it was his unwavering support for slavery. He saw Lincoln's presidency as a threat to the South, who mostly did not want slavery to end. Booth and his cohorts believed an end to slavery would grant citizenship and voting rights to African Americans. Back then, African Americans were mostly slaves and were not allowed to vote or have the same rights as their white captors. The likes of Booth wanted that to continue. Public opinion was divided over the assassination. Some folks, mostly from the south of the country, saw Booth as a hero. Others, however, were appalled, viewing his act as a heinous crime against a beloved leader. The newspapers, even in the South, expressed dismay and sympathy over Lincoln's assassination, contrary to Booth's expectations. For 12 days, Booth evaded capture, but was later tracked down by Union soldiers to a barn in Virginia state where he was hiding. During the standoff that ensued, the soldiers set the barn on fire to lure him out. Booth was then shot by Sergeant Boston Corbett, a member of the Union cavalry, who aimed for Booth's neck, but instead struck him in the back of the head. John Wilkes Booth later died from his injuries on April 26, 1865. It was claimed while he remained a fugitive, help from a certain Dr. Samuel Mudd, who treated his broken leg sustained during his escape from the theater. You might be wondering what happened to Lincoln's wife? After the assassination, Mary Todd. Lincoln's reaction to the assassination of her husband, President Abraham Lincoln, was one of profound grief and public mourning. On the night of the assassination, she was initially present at her husband's bedside. However, due to her uncontrollable grief, she was asked to leave by Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. In the days following the assassination, Mary Todd Lincoln faced immense public scrutiny. Her intense and public expressions of grief were seen as unseemly for a woman of her social standing at the time. Despite the era being known for its elaborate mourning customs, upper-class women were expected to control their emotions in public. Mary's behavior, which included loud wailing and expressions of pain, was criticized and viewed as evidence of an improper woman. Mary did not attend Lincoln's funeral, and she was deeply hurt by the lack of sympathy from the new president, Andrew Johnson, who neither visited her nor wrote a note of condolence. This, along with the loss of her husband and the public humiliation she faced, contributed to her suffering a mental breakdown. Her servant and confidant Elizabeth Hobbs Keckley later described Mary's grief as the wails of a broken heart, the unearthly shrieks, the terrible convulsions. These reactions, though understandable for someone who had just witnessed her spouse's traumatic assassination, were at odds with the societal expectations of the time. Mary Todd Lincoln's life after the assassination was marked by sorrow and controversy as she struggled to navigate her role as the widow of a martyred president in a society that often misunderstood and criticized her actions and emotions. Please note, this narrative is a creative and detailed interpretation of historical events, not an actual eyewitness account. However, it's based on historical event. Don't forget to subscribe and let me know what you think of this story. Hit the like button too.